parents promised to pay for college, but spent my tuition on a holiday home instead. For as long as I could remember, my parents had promised me one thing: when the time came, they would pay for my college tuition. No hesitation, no doubts. It was something I never had to question, something I had been reassured of countless times. But when I turned 18, everything changed. I grew up in a comfortable home. My dad owned a thriving business, and my mom was a moderately successful real estate agent. We weren't billionaires, but we were well off enough that I never had to worry about money. Private school? Paid for. Essentials? Always covered. I never even had to work a single day, because why would I? My parents always assured me that they had everything under control. I trusted them. Completely. I wasn't spoiled, at least not in the way people think. I didn't throw tantrums over not getting a new car or demand ridiculous luxuries. I was a simple kid, easygoing, never asked for much. My parents provided, and I believed them when they said my future was secure. Then, something started shifting. As my 18th birthday approached, my dad became different. He spent more and more time locked away in his office, looking drained, stressed, constantly checking his phone. It wasn't like him. I noticed, of course. Asked my mom about it more than once. But she always brushed it off. He's fine, just work stuff. So, I let it go. I had my finals to focus on, and whatever was bothering him, I figured it would pass. Then came my birthday. That morning, my parents entered my room, wished me well, but something about their faces, stiff, uneasy, made my stomach twist. Then, they said it. Get dressed. We need to have a family meeting downstairs. A family meeting? On my birthday? That should have been my first sign that something was very wrong. I hurried downstairs, heart pounding slightly, but still clueless about what was coming. They sat me down, exchanged glances, and my father finally spoke. He had been keeping something from me. 4 months. His business had been struggling badly. He had been cutting his own salary to keep his employees paid, while my mother took over handling household expenses. It had been tough, but they had managed. I exhaled in relief. If things were getting better, then we'd be fine. Right? Except that wasn't the end of it. That wasn't why we were here. Then came the real gut punch. We won't be able to pay for your college. The words hit me like a brick wall. I blinked, waiting for some kind of follow-up, some reassurance that this was temporary, that there was a backup plan. But there was nothing. They had promised me this. For years. Over and over again. And now, just like that, it was gone. I swallowed hard. Why? If things were improving, why couldn't they still afford it? That's when they dropped the final bombshell. A few months before my dad's business took a hit, they had spent my entire college fund. On a holiday home. In Cairo. My brain short-circuited. A holiday home? They had chosen to sink all that money into a luxury they didn't need, instead of setting it aside for my future? And here's the kicker, they could have sold it. Could have recovered a good chunk of that money. But they didn't. Wouldn't. Because they were emotionally attached to it. Emotionally attached to a vacation house. But not to the promise they had made to their son. I lost it. I yelled. I demanded to know why they didn't tell me sooner, why they didn't at least warn me so I could have gotten a part-time job, saved something. But they had nothing to say. Just weak excuses about how they thought the business would bounce back quickly, how they didn't expect things to spiral like this. They sat there, trying to justify it, while I sat there, feeling my world collapse. The trust one had in them, shattered. The future I had envisioned, gone. They had made their choice. And it wasn't me. Because otherwise, it would only create trouble for me later. And it did. That day turned into an all-out war. The argument exploded, words cutting deep. My parents accused me of being selfish, of caring only about money, an entitled, ungrateful brat. But was I really? I wasn't asking for luxury. I wasn't demanding anything beyond what they had promised me for years. If they had never committed to paying for my college, I wouldn't have expected it. But they had. Over and over. And then, out of nowhere, just weeks before I was supposed to start, they pulled the rug out from under me. How was I supposed to be okay with that? The fight ended in slammed doors and bitter silence. I stormed up to my room, collapsed onto my bed, and let the weight of it all sink in. It was my birthday, but I felt like I had lost everything. I shut off my phone, refusing to see the messages, the missed calls. The future I had been planning for was crumbling before my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Sure, I could take out a student loan, but even that wasn't an option without my parents signing off on it. And given their financial struggles, I knew they wouldn't. If they had been willing, they would have suggested it themselves. Instead, they left me drowning in uncertainty, alone in my room, consumed by frustration and heartbreak. But the worst part? They didn't even check on me. Hours passed, the house quiet, and not once did they knock on my door. Not once did they ask if I was okay. That hurt more than anything. At first, I just felt sad. But as the day dragged on, sadness turned to something sharper, anger. And in the heat of that anger, I made a decision. I was going to teach them a lesson. I grabbed a bag, started stuffing in clothes. I had no real plan, no destination, I just knew I needed to leave. At 18, I thought I was making a bold stand. I thought I was proving a point. In reality, I was acting out of emotion, blinded by hurt. But at that moment, all I wanted was for them to feel even a fraction of what I was feeling. I waited until the house was quiet, slipped out through the kitchen door, careful not to make a sound. My heart pounded as I stepped into the night, half expecting someone to stop me. No one did. And so, I walked away. There was only one place I knew I could go, my girlfriend's house. My childhood sweetheart, the one person who had always been in my corner. She had been calling me all morning, worried after I suddenly went silent. I hadn't responded to a single message, hadn't even told her I had canceled the party we had planned. So instead of texting back, I showed up at her door. The second she saw me, concern washed over her face. "Where have you been?" she asked, pulling me inside. I was worried sick. We hugged, and for the first time that day, I felt a sliver of comfort. Then, I told her everything. She was stunned. She had known my parents for years, had seen them at their best and worst, but this? Even she struggled to believe they would just cut me off like that. When I admitted I had run away, that I planned to stay with her for a few days, she seemed hesitant but didn't protest. Her parents, on the other hand, were a different story. When they found out about my plan, they were firm but gentle. They tried to reason with me, explaining that running away wasn't the solution, that it could make things worse. But I was too caught up in my emotions to listen. I argued, convinced I was doing the right thing. They didn't argue back. Instead, they picked up the phone and called my parents. I figured it would be simple. Maybe they'd convince my parents to apologize, to see how unfair they were being. That's all I wanted. The bare minimum. But I was wrong. When they returned to the room an hour later, their faces were unreadable. And then, they gave me the news. I wasn't going home. My parents refused to take me back. Apparently, on that phone call, my father had been furious. He didn't see me as a kid who was hurt or betrayed. He saw me as an ungrateful, selfish burden. His words were sharp, final. If I wanted to leave, then I could stay gone. He was done. Unless I apologized and begged for forgiveness, I was no longer their responsibility. But my girlfriend's parents didn't tell me everything they had heard. They spared me from the harshest details, only saying that I would need to stay with them for a while. At the time, I didn't mind. I thought this was temporary. I thought my parents would come around, that this would all blow over. But 3 days passed. And then, staying at Haley's house felt like a temporary escape, but reality caught up fast. One evening, her parents sat me down, their faces heavy with concern. They hesitated, then finally told me the truth. My parents had made their stance clear. They weren't going to speak to me. Not until I apologized. Apologize? For what? I was furious. I told them outright, I had nothing to apologize for. I had every right to be upset, every right to react the way I did. The mere thought of bowing down and admitting fault when I knew I was justified made my blood boil. Haley's parents tried to reason with me. They assured me they were on my side, that they believed my parents were being unreasonable. But still, they gently reminded me, I had to go back home eventually. And for that, I needed to make peace. But I refused. No matter how much they pleaded, I stood firm. I wasn't going to apologize, not when I knew I was right. If it came down to it, I wouldn't even go home at all. I didn't want to be a burden on them either, so I'd find another place to stay. But Haley's parents wouldn't hear of it. They loved me like their own, and they made that clear. Leaving wasn't an option. This fight would get resolved one way or another, but until then, their home was mine. I tried again, insisting I didn't want to inconvenience them. They shut it down immediately. You are not a burden, they told me. That kindness? It meant everything. So I stayed. Days turned into weeks. And before I knew it, it was time for college. Yes, college. Something I never thought would be possible. And I had my in-laws to thank for that too. About a week after I left home, Haley's father sat me down. He had arranged for my tuition. Just like that, the impossible became reality. He assured me there was no pressure, I could pay it back when I had a job, and there were no interest rates. It wasn't a loan, it was an opportunity. Then he suggested something I wasn't expecting. Call your dad, he said. Talk to him. Settle this and go home. But that wasn't an option for me. Money wasn't the issue. It never was. The problem was trust, the betrayal of knowing my parents had strung me along, feeding me false hope, knowing all along they would eventually let me down. That wasn't something I could just forgive. Even if they had nothing, even if they were struggling, I would have loved them just the same. But the lies? That's what broke me. I told Haley's dad I couldn't accept his money. I didn't want to be in debt to him. But he refused to let me refuse. College isn't optional, he told me. I already borrowed the money from a friend, it's yours now. He left me no choice. And so, I went. And it turned out to be the best decision of my life. I'll never forget what Haley's dad did for me. He gave me a home when I had none. He gave me a future when mine seemed out of reach. And he even tried, so many times, to mend the broken bond between me and my parents. But nothing worked. They wouldn't budge. Years passed. Not a single word from them. That last fight? It became the last time I ever saw them. When I graduated, they weren't there. When I got engaged, they didn't call. When I got married, they didn't show up. They had cut me off. Completely. I always thought, deep down, they would come around. That at some point, they'd realize what they had lost. But as the years dragged on, that hope faded. Haley's parents filled the void as much as they could. They reminded me constantly that I wasn't alone. They told me my parents would be proud of me. But how could I believe that when they had abandoned me so easily? It was hard. Growing up, my parents were everything to me. And yet, one argument was all it took to erase everything we had. They chose their pride over their son. They chose their ego over family. And so, the silence remained. A decade passed. 10 years. And life? It moved on. I got married to the love of my life. No surprises there, of course, I married Haley. Then, a year ago, we welcomed a beautiful baby boy. Our perfect little family. My parents? They never reached out. Never asked about their grandson. And that told me everything I needed to know. They had countless chances to mend things. Graduation. My engagement. My wedding. The birth of my child. But they chose not to. And that was their decision. They had seen everything. Every event I attended, every milestone I shared, it was all right there on my social media. There was no way they didn't know. I had plenty of relatives at it, and at least one of them must have told them. But they never reached out. They never cared. Despite everything, I still missed them. But I had long since stopped hoping they would ever contact me. It had become painfully clear that, to them, nothing mattered more than themselves. Acknowledging their mistakes? That was never going to happen. And if they couldn't even admit to what they had done all those years ago, how could I ever let them back into my life? It would only lead to more toxicity, more heartache. The only way we could ever have a relationship again was if they finally faced the truth. Until that happened, there was nothing left to say. Then, out of nowhere, about a week ago, my dad called me. After nearly a decade of silence, his voice was suddenly on the other end of the line. But it wasn't good news. At first, the conversation was stiff. A few pleasantries about my job, my life. And then he dropped it, the reason he had called at all. My mother was sick. He wanted me to come home. Just for a few days. I felt my chest tighten. What's wrong? I asked, dreading the answer. Parkinson's. Diagnosed years ago. And she was suffering. Years. I couldn't even process it at first. My mother had been battling a degenerative disease, and no one had thought to tell me. Regardless of everything that had happened between us, this was something I should have known. The anger came fast and sharp. Why didn't you tell me? I snapped. His answer was cold, almost indifferent. Because we didn't think you'd care. You hadn't reached out in so long. And just like that, we were back in the same vicious cycle. A screaming match over the phone. Both of us hurling accusations, blaming each other for the years of silence. Ego against ego. Each convinced we were the one in the right. Then my father's voice cracked. I knew this was a mistake. Your mother thought you might care, but I told her you wouldn't. I told her you'd never let go of your grudge. And then, he hung up. I sat there, gripping my phone, heart pounding. I had just fought with my father, again. But this time, it wasn't over something from the past. It was about my mother. About time that was slipping away. I told my wife everything. She listened, then sighed. You should have just agreed to go, she said gently. She's still your mother. She's sick. And if she wants to see you, isn't that more important than whatever happened years ago? I shook my head. I don't want to go back there. If I do, I'll have to acknowledge everything. I'll have to face my father. And he'll expect me to apologize, or at least pretend like none of this ever happened. I can't do that. But a darker thought gnawed at me. What if I never saw them again? What if this was it? Update 1. I had another long talk with my wife, and this time, she really made me see how I was acting just like my father. Stubborn. Unyielding. I didn't want to be like that. So, I made a decision. I was going to visit my parents. Not to apologize, because I still didn't think I owed them that. And I knew they wouldn't apologize to me either. But it was time to put the past aside, at least enough to see my mother. In just a few hours, I'll be heading out. My wife will stay home with our son, but if things go well, I might invite them over. This feud has dragged on for too long. It's time to put an end to it. For my mother. For my son. For myself. I don't know how they'll react when they see me. But I'm hoping, for the first time in a long time, that it will be okay. Fingers crossed. Update 2. I just got back. And for the first time in nearly a decade, I feel like I can breathe again. The moment my father opened the door and saw me standing there, he broke. Tears filled his eyes as he pulled me into a crushing hug. And I couldn't hold it together either. Years of pain, silence, anger, all of it melted away in that moment. Then I saw my mother. She wasn't the woman I remembered. The disease had taken so much from her. She was frail, her movement stiff, her voice softer than I ever recalled. Seeing her like that, it hurt. More than I can even put into words. We talked for hours. About everything. My life. The years we lost. And somewhere in those conversations, the past stopped feeling so heavy. Then something happened I never expected. They apologized. For everything. For the choices they made, for the things they said, for how they handled it all. We should have been better parents, my father admitted, his voice raw. And in that moment, I let go of my own anger. Maybe I could have been a better son, I admitted. I left that house with something I hadn't had in years, peace. Before I walked out the door, I extended an invitation. Next week, they'll come over for dinner. They'll finally meet their grandson. I don't know who's more excited, me or them. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have my family back. When I told my wife, she was overjoyed. So now, we're making plans for next week. Maybe this is the start of something new. Maybe we're finally putting the pieces back together. Update 3. The family dinner just ended. And honestly, it was perfect. Warm. Comfortable. Like all those years apart never even happened. My parents and my in-laws reconnected after so long. And my parents met my son for the first time. It was emotional, overwhelming. We all cried. And we all knew this was something worth holding on to. Sitting at that table, surrounded by the people I love, I realized just how much I had missed my parents. How much I had lost in the years we spent apart. And with my mother's condition, I don't want to waste another second. I don't know how much time I have left with her. But I do know one thing. I won't let it slip away. Not again. We're making this a regular thing. We're going to rebuild what we lost. This time, for good.